Welcome to The Debate. Look at the word running in these two sentences. Running is fun and, well, the running water.
Right.
If you are listening to this right now, your brain effortlessly processes one as a thing and the other as a description.
Yeah, it's practically automatic.
Exactly. But for centuries, grammarians have been fighting this bitter, honestly kind of ridiculous war over what to actually call them. Today, we are diving into the classification of English words ending in ing.
A surprisingly vicious battlefield.
Very. Specifically, we're asking if the traditional boundary between gerunds and present participles is a necessary framework that we must preserve or, an outdated historical artifact we need to discard.
Do we define words by the functional jobs they do in a sentence?
Or do we adopt the modern linguistic approach that just merges them into a single gerund-participle category based on their identical outward form? And this debate emerges from major texts spanning the history of linguistics, culminating in modern analyses like Huddleston and Pullum's Cambridge Grammar of the English Language.
Which is a massive text.
Huge. So briefly, I will be arguing for the modern linguistic merger because their physical shapes are totally identical.
While I'll be arguing that preserving the traditional distinction is essential because their syntactic functions in a sentence are fundamentally different.
Right. So let's start with the physical reality of the language as it exists today. The distinction between gerunds and present participles it cannot be sustained if you actually look at the evidence.
I imagine you're going to bring up the form issue.
I am. Huddleston and Pullum make this brilliant, incredibly clear argument. There is no verb in the English language that shows any difference in form between these two constructions.
None?
Not even the verb to be, which is famously irregular and messy. Listeners, picture a traditional gerund sentence in your mind, right? Destroying the files was a mistake.
A completely random, definitely not legally incriminating example.
Obviously. Now picture a traditional participle sentence. The train approaching platform 3 is late. The words destroying and approaching operate the exact same way structurally when it comes to inflection. We do not need two different names for the same word just because we place it in a different slot.
But form is not the only metric for categorization, and I would argue it shouldn't even be the primary one. Function is what matters here.
Okay, explain the function difference for the audience, because I think it's splitting hairs.
It's really not. When we talk about a gerund, we are talking about an ing word that functions strictly as a noun. It acts as a subject, a direct object, maybe the object of a preposition.
Right.
A present participle functions as an adjective, modifying a noun, or it helps build a continuous verb tense.
But why do those functions demand entirely separate labels? It's the same word.
Because lumping them together obscures the logic of the sentence. Let's look at a classic, kind of funny example from the traditional literature. Since Abigail was 13, dancing has been her least favorite thing.
Okay, poor Abigail.
Right. Picture that sentence. Dancing sits squarely in the subject slot. It's an activity, it is a thing, that is a gerund. But if I change the context and say, the dancing bear is cute.
Wait, is the bear doing the Macarena?
I mean, presumably, but the word dancing is no longer a thing itself in that sentence. It is actively modifying the bear. It's behaving like an adjective. That is a participle.
Okay, but
just to finish the thought, a noun doesn't magically become a preposition just because it moves around a sentence. So an ing word's fundamental grammatical role demands distinct terminology to map what is actually happening.
Let's pause on that for a second, because we need to talk about where this distinct terminology actually comes from. It isn't some natural law of English. It's an artificial hangover from Latin grammar.
Oh, I wouldn't call it artificial. It's historical.
But it's a history that doesn't belong to English. Look, in Latin, gerunds and present participles were completely different physical words. A Latin gerund was a verbal noun, and it used this nd affix in its construction.
Right, like the famous ones.
Exactly. Take the Latin verb lego, which means I read. The gerund form was legendum, meaning the act of reading, and it followed specific noun declensions.
Meaning the ending of the word changed depending on its role in the sentence.
Right. Latin gerunds didn't even have a nominative form. If you wanted to make it the subject of a sentence, you had to use the infinitive.
Like the classic phrase, curare est difficile, to run is difficult. You couldn't use a gerund there in Latin.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the Latin present participle was a totally different beast. It was an adjective, and it used an ns or nt affix, like amans, for loving.
So you could literally see the difference.
Yes, you could look at legendum and look at amans and physically see they were different categories. But English grammarians, particularly in the Victorian era, were just obsessed with forcing English into this prestigious Latin corset.
They did love their Latin models.
They looked at our single ing word and decided to artificially slice it in half, just to make English grammar look more like Latin grammar. It's an illusion.
Okay, you're absolutely right that Victorian grammarians loved a Latin shoehorn. But I have to push back on the idea that the distinction itself is an illusion in English. Have you considered the actual morphological history of Old English?
You're talking about the Germanic roots?
Precisely. The underlying logic of the Latin distinction applies perfectly to English because English used to have different physical forms for these words too.
I'm pretty sure they didn't look like Latin, though.
They didn't look like Latin, no, but they were distinct. Before the Norman conquest, in Old English, the present participle had its own distinct ending. It was E-N-D-E.
Wait, E-N-D?
Yes. So if you wanted to say writing as a modifier, it was ridinde, but the verbal noun, the gerund, ended in UNG or ING.
Interesting.
Over centuries of linguistic evolution, and honestly, just lazy pronunciation, the unstressed syllables eroded. The END ending morphed and collapsed into the verbal noun ending. So yes, today they both end in ING.
Which proves my point.
No, it doesn't. Just because their outward spellings merged over time doesn't mean their syntactic DNA merged.
But if the morphology is collapsed, the language has moved on.
The spelling moved on. The structural reality did it. If I say running is fun, running is a noun subject. If I say the running water is cold, running is an adjective, modifying water. They are fundamentally different conceptual units.
Are they, though?
Yes. Think of it like two rivers merging into one channel. It doesn't mean the water originally came from the same mountain.
Okay, but if I hand you a glass of water from that merged river, you can't tell me which mountain it came from just by looking at it.
Nice counter-analogy.
Thank you. Even if we accept that they evolved from two different historical branches, in the reality of modern English, they are one branch. And because they're one branch, splitting them into strictly noun or adjective categories is highly problematic when we actually test them.
Well, let's test them then, because the diagnostic tests for these words are quite robust, and they prove that the categories behave differently in modern English. Let's look at degree adverbs.
For the audience, when we say degree adverbs, we mean words like very or extremely that turn up the volume on a description.
Right. Participles, because they act like adjectives, happily accept degree adverbs. You can say, the movie is very amusing.
Sure.
Amusing is a participle, and very modifies it perfectly. But you absolutely cannot do that with a gerund. You cannot say, very running is good for you, or I enjoy very reading. It causes a total syntactic crash.
I mean, I feel like very running perfectly describes an exhausting marathon, but grammatically, sure, it's a disaster. I concede that pure gerunds don't take degree adverbs.
We can go further, too. Look at genitive subjects.
Which is essentially a possessive form, right?
Exactly. Gerund clauses can take a possessive subject. I can say, I resent his being late. The word his modifies the gerund being. You cannot stick a possessive subject onto a participle modifying a noun. These tests clearly delineate two different operational behaviors. One engine runs like a noun, the other runs like an adjective.
I hear you, but you are isolating the properties that separate them while totally ignoring the massive, glaring property that unites them: their verbal nature.
What do you mean?
Let me offer a mechanical analogy to counter yours. Think of the ing form as a multi-tool, like a Swiss Army knife.
Okay.
Just because you use the screwdriver head 1 minute to tighten a screw and the knife blade the next minute to slice an apple, it doesn't mean you have two completely different tools in your pocket. It is one single tool occupying different functional slots.
But a screwdriver is fundamentally not a knife.
But they are both attached to the same handle.
Both traditional gerunds and participles retain their underlying verbal properties. And this is crucial for the listeners to visualize. They can both take direct objects.
Give me an example.
Look at the gerund. I enjoy baking cakes. If baking were purely a noun, like the word table, it couldn't take the direct object cakes. You can't say, I enjoy table cakes.
Unless it's a cake shaped like a table. But yes, syntactically, you're right.
Right. Now look at the participle. I saw a man eating cakes. Again, the ing word takes the direct object cakes. Neither a pure noun nor a pure adjective can take a direct object.
True. So to call one a noun and the other an adjective is incredibly reductive. It is vastly more elegant to view the gerund participle as a non-finite verb form. You know, a verb form that doesn't show tense, that simply plugs into different functional slots. Sometimes it's the subject, sometimes it's a modifier.
Okay, let's take this out of the theoretical realm and into the practical, because your multi-tool analogy actually highlights the danger of merging these terms.
How so?
If I ask you to hand me a tool to cut this apple, and you hand me the screwdriver, you have failed the functional task. We need specific names for the specific functions because the functions are what we interact with as writers and speakers. When the grammar breaks down, you need the right diagnostic tool to fix it.
You're leading us toward dangling modifiers, aren't you?
Exactly. The infamous dangling participle and the dangling gerund. If we just lump everything into gerund participle, we lose the precision required to explain exactly why a sentence is structurally broken.
I have to disagree strongly here. The merged gerund participle framework is fully capable of explaining those errors without needing the dusty traditional labels. The failure is identical in both cases.
I don't see how it's identical.
Let's look at a classic dangling modifier. Picture this sentence. Sitting in Cafe Opus, my car got a parking ticket.
A wonderful, ridiculous sentence.
Right, so we have a mental image of a Honda Civic just sipping a tiny espresso at a cafe table.
Reading a newspaper.
Exactly. Now, the structural failure here is incredibly simple to explain using modern terminology. The implied agent of the non-finite ing clause, the person doing the sitting, does not match the grammatical subject of the main clause, which is the car.
Yes, that is a classic dangling participle.
Now let's look at what traditionalists call a dangling gerund. Upon entering the crypt, my hair stood on end.
Yes.
Again, a hilarious image. A patch of hair unlocking a crypt door and wandering in, like Cousin It from the Addams Family.
A terrifying image, frankly.
But the structural failure is exactly the same mechanism. The implied agent of entering doesn't match the grammatical subject, my hair. In both cases, the non-finite gerund participle clause is misaligned with the subject of the main clause. We do not need separate terms to diagnose that. The mechanical failure is identical.
The result is identical, which is absurdity. But the mechanical breakdown happens in completely different parts of the sentence's engine.
What do you mean?
If a mechanic tells you, your car is broken, that's not helpful. You need to know if the transmission failed or the brakes failed. In your first example, sitting in Cafe Opus, the phrase is an adjectival phrase. It's supposed to be modifying a noun. A dangling participle fails because an adjectival modifier is attaching itself to the wrong noun. It is fundamentally an adjective failure.
And how is the crypt different?
In upon entering the crypt, the word entering is the object of the preposition upon. It is functioning as a noun inside a prepositional phrase. The failure here is that the verbal noun's implicit agent is misaligned. Maintaining the distinction between a participle, which is an adjective modifier, and a gerund, which is a noun object, provides vital surgical precision for diagnosing exactly how the sentence's logic collapsed.
Is it really surgical precision, though? Or is it just pedantic overclassification? Because the deeper we go, the more these categories start to blur. Let's talk about foreign language acquisition, which is where this debate has massive real-world stakes.
Oh, absolutely.
For English as a second language students, the gerund is a notoriously brutal concept.
It is, because it looks like a continuous verb, but acts like a noun. If a Spanish speaker wants to say, I like swimming, they naturally lean on their native framework. In Spanish, me gusta nadar.
Right, nadar.
Nadar is the infinitive form, to swim. Spanish uses infinitives for noun slots. But in English, we require the gerund, swimming, in that slot. This is exactly why the traditional term is so crucial.
I don't see how.
If we tell ESL students, oh, swimming is just a gerund participle, we aren't helping them map the concept. The term gerund isolates that nominal function, making it clear that in English, this specific ing word is doing the exact job their native infinitive does.
Let me jump in there. That's actually exactly where the modern term shines. You tell the Spanish-speaking student, in English, this versatile multi-tool, the gerund participle, handles the job that your infinitive does in Spanish.
That's so vague.
It isn't, though. You don't need to burden them with a false dichotomy between gerunds and participles, forcing them to memorize which is which. You just teach them the distribution of the ing form. Here are the places you can put an ing word. It's a much cleaner, more empirical way to teach the language.
I don't believe it's a false dichotomy. It is deeply embedded in how English resolves ambiguity. Take verbs like stop and remember, which highlight why recognizing function is so crucial for meaning.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I say, I remembered to buy the milk, I used an infinitive. It means I remembered the task and then I went and performed it. But if I say, I remembered buying the milk, I used a gerund, and the temporal meaning shifts completely. It means I possess a memory of a past event.
I completely agree with that.
But notice the overlap and confusion when we look at progressive participles. Take the phrase, she kept coming.
Okay, listeners, picture that sentence. She kept coming.
Traditional grammar says coming is a participle here, related to the progressive aspect, an ongoing action. Now compare it to she started coming. In traditional grammar, coming is categorized as a gerund here. It's the direct object of started.
Wait, run that by me again. Kept coming versus started coming. They sound morphologically and syntactically identical to me as a native speaker. Why on earth does traditional grammar split them?
Because the surrounding verbs govern different structural realities. Keep triggers a progressive participle modifier. Start triggers a nominal object. If we throw everything into a blender and just call it gerund participle, we blur the incredibly fine lines between progressive aspect and nominal objects. The precision of the traditional terms allows us to chart these intricate verb patterns without getting lost in the weeds.
I see the appeal of having a specific label for every micro-interaction, I really do. But blending them into gerund participle doesn't blur the lines, it clarifies them by removing artificial borders. Let's look at the ambiguity of the ing word in a different context. I'll give you a sentence. The kidnapping of the children was front-page news.
A tragic sentence, but grammatically fascinating.
Is. If you're listening, visualize that sentence. The kidnapping of the children. Notice how we put the definite article, the, right in front of it, and it's followed by an of prepositional phrase. According to everyone, traditionalists and modernists alike, kidnapping is acting purely as a noun here.
Correct. It is a nominal gerund.
But now contrast that with this sentence. Kidnapping the children was a terrible crime.
The article is gone.
The article the is gone. The preposition of is gone. Now, kidnapping takes the direct object, the children.
Right. That is a verbal gerund.
Exactly. And as we established earlier, nouns don't take direct objects. The more we zoom in, the more we see that English ing words exist on this massive gradient.
A gradient, yes.
On one far end, they are purely nominal, like the building. On the other far end, they are purely verbal, like she is building. But in the middle, they mix and match properties constantly. Drawing a hard line and saying, on this side of the line, it is a noun called a gerund, and on this side, it is an adjective called a participle, forces a binary onto a fluid reality.
I see what you're saying, but
By embracing the unified term gerund participle, we acknowledge the gradient. It is a hybrid, secondary verb form. That is its true nature.
you're asking the right question about the gradient, but I think you're drawing the wrong conclusion. The gradient exists, absolutely, but the traditional terms, verbal noun, gerund, participle, are the mile markers on that gradient.
But if the road is perfectly smooth, why put up arbitrary signs?
Because if you remove the mile markers and just call the whole highway gerund participle, you lose the map entirely. A word acting as a noun and a word acting as an adjective are doing fundamentally different jobs, even if their spellings merged 1,000 years ago.
I just don't think we need the map if we have the word itself.
But we do. Whether we are diagnosing a dangling modifier with a car parked in a cafe, drinking an espresso, or trying to teach complex syntax to a Spanish speaker, preserving these distinct terms provides clarity, it provides precision, and frankly, it provides a necessary link to the historical mechanics of how our language actually operates.
But a map is only useful if it accurately reflects the territory. The unified term gerund-participle respects the physical, morphological truth of modern English.
The visual truth, maybe.
The structural truth. It clears away centuries of forced Latin categorization. A word ending in ing does not change its shape when it moves from being a subject to being a modifier. Adopting the modern approach provides a much more elegant, empirically accurate framework for understanding how these non-finite verbs actually behave across the different slots of a sentence.
Well, despite our profound disagreement on the labels, I think we both agree that English ing words are fascinatingly complex little engines.
Very true.
They blend verbal properties with nominal or adjectival roles in ways that fiercely challenge rigid categorization.
They truly do. They are the multi-tools of the English language, and, reflecting on this debate, it becomes clear that how we choose to classify words, whether by their visible form or by their hidden structural function, deeply shapes how we understand the architecture of human thought.
It really does. There is so much more to explore in the historical evolution of English morphosyntax, from the Old English ende to the modern ing.
The debate between form and function is one of the oldest in linguistics, and this ing suffix is undoubtedly its most vibrant battleground.
I would agree with that.
Which brings us back to our opening thought. When you look at the word running, sitting on a page, is it exactly what it looks like, or is it defined by the invisible structural work it's doing behind the scenes?
When you encounter this grammatical chameleon in the wild, which reality will you trust?
A question to keep us all awake at night. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.